I do want to talk about your on the ground reporting a little more. What was your experience in Iraq like?
So I've been covering Iraq. Really, I was there since 2014 from the rise of ISIS. And I remember it just sort of struck me as this country that had gone so far. And again, this all does stem from the US invasion. So when Saddam was killed and the Ba'ath Party and the military that he had was disbanded, you had a whole bunch of people that were left with their guns on the street, no longer with an army to go to and with a job. And what you eventually saw was a lot of these leaders and these generals from Saddam's army that became really the original leaders of ISIS, and that became just the probably the most violent of all of them. And the sectarianism really struck me. And I think that was something that I talked to Paul Bremer about. Paul Bremer, of course, was in charge of the CPA, who that Bush appointed to essentially rebuild Iraq with this new constitution and government. And the one thing he said to me was the biggest mistake that was made was underestimating how far the Shia community would then take their, I guess, vengeance for power once the Sunnis were taken out. And you really saw that really with the rise of Iraq and with ISIS rather. And you saw that with this militia just coming in, and these were a Sunni militia coming in to kind of seek their own revenge after having felt repressed for so long since the invasion of the United States. So that to me, I mean, it all sort of stems from that. And you're still seeing these power struggles that exist today. And they did not really exist to that degree prior to 2003. So that to me probably was the most remarkable thing. And then I also have to acknowledge what I think on a brighter side of things was also seeing how the Iraqis did fight for their country and seeing how once they did get the training and the weapons from the US and from the coalition, how much there was a willingness that I'd never really seen before to take back their country and that there was something more to fight for. So that was probably the biggest silver lining for me was seeing this sort of emergent force that was willing to really fight for their country and do whatever it took to take that back from a terrorist organization. But in my more recent experiences in being in Iraq, I see remnants of a country that still can't form a government, that still hasn't properly dealt with the ISIS issue. And it always seems to me to be on the verge of the next terrorism threat. And I say that in large part because you have a huge part of the population that are basically stateless children. So you have these children that were born to ISIS fighters, sometimes by wives that were already married to these fighters, or by Yazidis or other groups that were forcibly taken and forcibly married to ISIS fighters. But Iraq will not acknowledge them as sort of citizens. So you have these huge groups in the population that are now growing up without sort of a proper identity, without a state to belong to, with no ability to go to school or be part of the education system. And that worries me as to where that leads to Iraq in the next 10 years.
Do you think this instability, this sense that they can't form a really stable government, that ISIS rose to the power it did, does that all stem, or was that like a domino effect from the US invasion?
I think, I mean, to a large degree, yes, it was a domino effect because you had these very disgruntled former army people that really had nowhere to go and needed to push back against that sense of being subjugated by the Shia majority. But I also think, you know, a lot of that stems in huge part from the corruption that the invasion enabled as well. And that to me really is one of the most underestimated root causes of any conflict is the corruption that exists within a government. If you have to pay money, which Iraqis still and certainly back then were doing, just to get through a checkpoint, to get to work, eventually that is going to turn you against your own government, to sort of see how hard you may have to work, and then to see your own leaders driving around in a Rolls Royce and wearing a Rolex. That has hugely contributed to the instability in the Iraqi population, is this inability to get hold of the corruption. And Iraq, of course, has a huge oil economy, and yet we don't really see any diversification away from the oil economy in Iraq. And we see we don't see that money necessarily going back into the community. And that is because Iraq is just an incredibly corrupt place where most of that money sort of lines the pockets of the top politicians and the powers to be rather than going back to the people. And the Iraqi population is very aware of that. I know, walking through to in the markets in Baghdad, I'll walk into a store and I'll see, someone sitting there and they'll be very versed in watching some sort of historical documentary or listening or understanding the news. Iraqis, regardless of their education level, are very vested in the news and the politics, and they're very passionate, and they are willing to go to the streets. And we've really been seeing such a rash of protests now since 2017, where masses will take to the streets to kind of fight for what they believe is their rights. And then we also see the huge pushback from a much more militarized police force, again influenced by Iran. So that also contributes to the instability in Iraq. And I think, to me, and I see it in so many parts of the world, corruption is really one of the most underlooked sources of problems in countries.